Angel Otero's work asks a lot of really interesting questions. Now, why I am so absolutely thrilled to have my colleague at the University of Houston, Dr. Natilee Harren, who's our contemporary, well, you heard her title, but who really is at the center of the contemporary discourse, is because I like to check my rather straightforward, maybe non-expert intuitions about this work with someone who actually is in the middle of it. And also, and I'm going to stop really soon, as somebody who does a lot of archaeology and art history in Latin America, I never, when I get outside the camp or walk, back into civilization, I love visiting Latin American Baroque, well, anything colonial, right? And so there's a lot of resonance and a lot of talk about the Latin American heritage that is somehow being worked through in Otero's work. And that's something that I'm viscerally familiar with because I've spent so much time in these churches just because I'm fascinated by that culture and by that visuality. But I want to know if I am just making sort of easy connections or if, in fact, he's working through that heritage in more sophisticated ways. And I think the way to do that is to have a contemporary art historian who is going to help me with these sorts of intuitions, these perhaps simple insights into Baroque.
Well, I'll take that baton and say that I also will sort of step off the podium of expert as well, actually. I just came back, as many of us have, from the College Art Association conference in New York, and I was part of a panel talking about the state of contemporary art history and asking questions about what are the appropriate geographic frames, temporal frames to use in this discipline. In other words, when does contemporary art stop or start? It stops in the present, of course. And also, how do we frame it geographically? Like, where is the contemporary located in the world? And one of the kind of abiding remarks that came out of those conversations was the necessity for collaboration, and that in a sort of globalized contemporary art history, nobody can be the expert of everything. And so actually, these kinds of conversations are really increasingly necessary in this field. And I think this exhibition is a good kind of case study for having these conversations and to begin to sort of work together to build a kind of multi-sided, to sort of borrow an anthropological term, kind of multi-sided art history.
So maybe we could take a moment, Natalee, to just define his working process, because it seems to me that that's a really important element in his work. And Valerie's catalog, which I highly recommend to everyone, the Otero catalog, I think it's certainly path-breaking in terms of the fact that this is the first time all of this has been gathered together, and this sort of talk has really been applied to Otero's work as a whole. But does everybody realize that these things that we see that are these luscious, gorgeous, thick leaves of paint that have been actually applied to these canvases were not painted in the traditional manner, but in fact he paints things on plexiglass, and then he builds up layers, almost sort of like a reverse process. He builds up layers of background so that one no longer sees what he paints, lets it dry maybe for a month, and then starts scraping it off, and that is the collage material that then is folded in on itself, is crunched, and he uses adhesive then to tack it to yet another canvas. And so there is this, both for me, a materiality that produces a very particular sensuality.
Right.
Is that, and that the first blush, my first sort of reaction, I don't know how you first encountered this, but my first reaction was that this is like some sort of drapery that I want to feel and revel in, and just, it's tactile and I love it, and sensual perhaps doesn't do it justice.
Right. There's a way in which sensuality is arrived at through a process that's really about destruction and decay.
Right.
And it's interesting that you make the kind of connection with tapestry because, of course, many of these early pieces are inspired by visits to his grandmother in Puerto Rico. So there is an evocation of domestic materials from tapestry to rugs. Actually, looking at these pieces, I thought there was a kind of, maybe it's just because we're in the halls of the CAM, there was a kind of interesting way in which some of these works reminded me of Mark Flood's lace transfer pieces, so which may be fresh in some people's minds. But there is a way in which the work is kind of flickering between beauty and decay at once. And the approach to painting is here kind of mediated or always from a kind of, I would say, skeptical position. And this definitely comes through in the catalog with Valerie's writing and also the conversation with the artist, where there is an incredible mood of doubt threaded throughout the artist's practice, which is really, I would say, kind of characteristic of contemporary painting, right? The kind of impossibility of the young artist and even mid-career artists kind of grappling with the weight of history. So it's worth remarking that, as far as I know, maybe Valerie will have to kind of chime in here, but this painting, for example, which is the painting from which the exhibition's title is taken, is one of these skin paintings where the artist is actually painting a kind of homage to the great Western masters throughout art history, but then peeling that skin off and transferring it in a way that totally undermines the origins and even referentiality of that image. And as far as I understand it, he is even sort of secretive or mysterious about the origins, or what this originally was, or?
That one is primarily abstracted.
Okay.
It's the Titian which is next to it, which is, of course, after Titian.
Yes.
And it's painted very figurative. And then the figuration is obscured over a course of laying paint after paint, layer after layer. And then when it gets affixed to the canvas, it gets further obscured.
Right.
The imagery.
So when Natalee refers to the weight of history, I mean, it's instantiated in that painting, literally.
Absolutely. And throughout a lot of the works here that are influenced by Baroque painters. So you're absolutely right about that. And literature also plays a big role in this. Everything and nothing Borges, so it has different references.
Right.
So art history is kind of taken as a sort of ready-made, I would say, and it's interesting. There are a lot of terms through which we can kind of thread the practice. So by taking paint, letting it dry, and peeling it off as a skin, paint is almost kind of transformed through the lens of the ready-made. So he has these kind of skins that he's working with and then applies. There's also kind of course, an element of collage there. And to kind of further meditate upon this kind of skepticism that I think is threaded through the practice, I might even push that further and call it a kind of violence. A violence that's being done to art history. I think Valerie in her essay calls it a kind of killing the father. There's this patricidal quality to it. It might be worth kind of dwelling on the masculinist or anti-masculinist quality kind of threaded throughout the practice. That's something that is really compelling but also troubling to me about the work, aside from these kind of earlier pieces that deal with the figure of the grandmother. The work seems very concerned with notions of a sort of heroic masculinity within the history of Western art.
Could I don't know if this is counter what you were saying, or if it's just because I'm coming from another tradition, really, the Latin American tradition. And when I'm looking at that Tiziano or that Titian, that to me is, you can read it in a Spanish or an Iberian Latin American historical trajectory. That was what made the sensuality of paint possible. Of course, Titian was all over the court of Philip II. I mean, he literally owned the Prado still does. And Velázquez then in the 17th century is looking at Titian and reinventing the sensuality of paint. And this is just off the top of my head, right? So please, let's be critical about this. And then Velázquez's acolytes end up in Latin America. and literally bring this tradition, revivify it for the Creoles. It becomes the national language of Mexico and other important Latin American elites. So the sensuality of paint is actually shot through, in my mind, Latin American political history as well as Latin American art history. Now, I don't know exactly how that's working with Ángel, but I really think that Titian's not a mistake or just a, here, let's do this. And in fact, one could argue that the sort of counter-reformation, the idea that art really does have a role to play in religiosity that came to Latin America encased in this really wonderful paint that was the legacy of Velázquez and others, that trickles down even into much more humble sort of circumstances, because one has smaller paintings or prints in your grandmother's house, right, where this visual culture, however vaguely or however sort of humbly, ends up still manifesting itself. And of course, this is what he's working with right here. So again, this is exactly what I wanted to do. We can go eat now, because someone coming from a Latin American perspective reads this in a very particular way. That Ángel was trained, though, at the Universidad de Puerto Rico or de San Juan, right? But his graduate training was in Chicago at the Art Institute. And I'm not sure how much, it would be interesting to ask him, what sort of rigorous training in Latin American art history he had there.
No, not really.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, too, because I know the Art Institute.
It brings a lot of this with him.
Yes. I think that he is working this out for himself. This is not, yeah.
It seems like in the practice it's both a burden and a source of energy. One of the funny details in the catalog that I really loved, I think that came through in the conversation, is he said that when he was a student at the Art Institute and he wanted to get other professors off his back, he would just say, oh, this is a painting about the way that light, sort of the phenomenon of light in the Caribbean, and they would just sort of go away. Because, okay, that's your thing. How
do you argue with that?
It's interesting how at times these kind of details from his background, like this kind of metalwork, wrought iron fence that was kind of around the balcony of his childhood home, comes in as both a biographical reference, and maybe we can sort of turn the corner and gaze at both the sculptures, which begin to kind of materialize that architectural element, that decorative architectural element, but also this canvas here, which incorporates it into an abstract painterly composition, which also is very much in conversation with the kind of modern contemporary abstract painting phenomenon of the grid and the rich discourse then that comes with the way the grid operates to kind of flatten the canvas, to map it out in this sort of rational way, but also then has a conversation with one-point perspective going back all the way to the Renaissance. And there's a continuation, too, of a kind of evocation of domesticity through this kind of wrinkling and crumpling and crunchiness of the canvas and of the dried paint on it.
Am I bringing too much to this to see this just drop-dead sensuality of the paint as a major physical sort of, it's the major physical thing in this painting? Or is that something that other people do not see, or it's not interesting to you? Yes?
Well, I agree with you, but I was thinking back to the other comments about technique. It reminded me of two things. One is South American churches are so colorful, very different from European. And there's a lot of painted plaster, as well as gold, and gold. Mm-hmm. So that I don't know if he spent much time in South American churches, because Puerto Rican churches are different. But that may be, but mostly I was struck by, it sounds like transferring frescoes, pulling it off and moving it.
see, that's interesting because the fresco material is not the same, it doesn't have the same sort of sensuality to me than oil does.
Right. It's not sensual, but the concept of just moving it all to a whole new place. Different size, different shape. Take what you can. That's just what struck me.
I think you want to touch it. There's a tension because you want to touch it. It's so tactile and just feel that so much.
Yeah.
And the way he gets that is by going through the process of making a two-dimensional work, which I find really interesting. I mean, I don't know exactly what to do with that, but the tactility emerges directly out of him manipulating the two-dimensional surface. And that I think speaks a lot more to the contemporary discourse on how does one paint when everything's been painted,
Right.
or something like the logic of the avant-garde.
It seems like a backdoor to an approach to abstract expressionism, perhaps, or this investment in the authenticity of the artist's gesture, where here you have clear evidence of, again, through this tactility and materiality, clear evidence of the artist working in a very bodily way with materials in the studio, but everything is mediated. Everything's mediated through a kind of transfer. It is indexical. There is evidence of physical contact here, but it's kind of at a remove. And actually, one question I have about this work, maybe for Valerie, is whether the marking, which suggests to me this grill work, is this actually kind of pressed upon that? So there you have this interesting.
Oh.
Right. Yeah, so next to the ready-made collage, we also have printmaking at play. And
Wow.
this is actually an interesting hinge painting, for me at least, between this area of the exhibition and what's happening over here, where you have at the very beginning of the practice a use of transfer that happens through the skins, here transfer by this literal application of the grill work, and then this other different strategy, this other different process that also involves a kind of transferal of one thing from the next, which I don't know, maybe this is a stretch, but maybe there's a kind of logic of transferal or transit that we can read across the work, which may have some sort of metaphorical relation to his kind of position within the geopolitics of contemporary art. That might be a sort of provisional argument that we could make in the moment of this exhibition.
Technique of folding it all that new. And I think of minimal artists, and even Russia did some of that. Linda Benglis took flat fabric, twisted it, hung it on the wall.
Generally hung it around an apparatus or a structure, and then put it on the wall. But you're right, coming from painting into sculpture and creating those hybrids. I think this is more about, it is about painting more than, and it's still on the flat two-dimensional surface, as opposed to looking at ways in which painting, you can just drop this notion that painting is only two-dimensional, which is where Natilee Benglis really falls, getting it away from the flat canvas structure onto the floor, onto other objects. So a little different, but surface play, texture play, absolutely same.
Is the paint that he's putting on the plexiglass, is it just oil paint or is it mixed with some other things?
All oil, only
So just
oil.
layers and layers and more layers. Wow. I wonder how it feels.
To get back to maybe other art historical precedents, one moment I think it's interesting to raise in conversation with this work is a kind of immediate post-World War II moment, thinking about arte povera, thinking about art informel. A lot of these painterly practices happening in Western Europe and also in Japan with Gutai, where artists were already kind of grappling with the kind of emerging history of high modernism vis-a-vis the kind of trauma of the immediate post-World War II context. And a lot of that work came together in this really interesting show that Paul Schimmel curated at MoCA a number of years ago called Destroying the Picture, Painting the Void. And it was about, kind of metabolizing the history through the realm of fine art. And it often manifested as this like really literal act of attacking the canvas. And I see a lot of that happening in here, this kind of, these are indices or testaments to these moments of difficulty in the studio.
I see a strong relation with his roots, because this work of iron is very used in Puerto Rico. We call it hierro forjado, I don't know the name in English, but the uses for furniture, for fences, for your windows is very, very popular. So it's a connection with his roots, I think.
I think he would agree, wouldn't he, Valerie?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're nods to home. And when you talk about violence, I think it's more like the trauma experienced through, I mean, Puerto Rico has a very contentious history, right? With Europe, with the US. And there is about this disruption that happens culturally. It's about the nostalgia and the violence that happens just when memory is disrupted and fragmented. I think you see those in the transfers. You certainly see those here. And in these early still lifes. It's about fragmenting what you know to be the figuration or representation of life and how that gets dissolved and reimagined or disrupted and absolutely obscured. So I think in these paintings, that's what happens, is he's sort of taking to task the contentious cultural histories that have been imposed upon Puerto Rico in an interesting way. Specifically looking at Baroque mirrors from French, Italian, and Spanish lineages. So I think that's what really happens. And it is a sort of push against colonialism, although he would never say that. It's clear that that's what it is. It's sort of the thing that you don't say, but you do. And so that, I believe, is really, and there is trauma there. It's a trauma that I think people just absorb. It's absorbed into the bodies, it's absorbed into the culture, it's syncretic in many ways, and he's bringing that to bear in the work. So.
Can we maybe shift further over and move over to the transfer works? Because I think these are very tricky materially.
Yes.
They're hard to understand, like, how the process works. And I think that's part of the magic of them. One of the other kind of formal aspects that strikes me about the work, which is kind of related to this thematic of distress and violence, is the way that time is invested in the canvases. So it's interesting it's almost surprising to me whenever I remind myself that, oh, this is only like a 10-year retrospective, because the different techniques he uses has a way of, I would say, kind of producing the illusion that the work is older than it is, and kind of giving this protracted sense of history in a painting that is actually very contemporary. And it is through, I would say, through this tactic of mediating his material, so that there is already kind of history, a procedural history, a history of artistic process kind of embedded in the materials by the time they even make their way onto the canvas. And it's worth kind of underscoring that this work, I don't know about the others, but this one is based actually on a photograph that was projected onto the canvas and sort of traced with silicone and then sort of powdered with black graphite. So that's what gives it this kind of gunky, chunky, but also very matte quality. And I'm wondering if you know, Valerie, does he fix the paintings?
He does spray it.
He does spray it, so it is fixed. But it still looks quite, almost like moldy, like it could continue to degrade before our very eyes.
Yes.
Yeah, this is sort of what attracts or absorbs the graphite into the surface. And this is a photograph of his father as a child, right? Yeah.
Natalee, they are all based upon photographs. Okay.
Thank you.
All of the transferences.
All of the
Was this developed? I don't remember the exact chronology. So this grew out. He was already doing the skins, right? When he started.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's literally doing figuration and abstraction.
Right.
So
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that interesting as well.
Yeah, and so this partakes in another kind of more recent art historical moment. Gerhard Richter is a painter who's often referred to, one who is sort of uniting the visual languages of painting and photography in a way that suggests that those two mediums have this relationship where, and for me, a work like this is sort of suggesting that although we often kind of take for granted that maybe photography has sort of superseded the role of painting in visual culture, this is sort of an argument that painting can still do things. Painting can still communicate in ways that are very effective, and that this history, which is alluded to in this art history, which is alluded to in other works, is not only a burden, but a kind of resource, a resource that the artist can continue to mine to keep his practice moving forward.
I know Felice's say we have very little time, so I wondered if we couldn't treat something or talk about something that you're interested in this work. But before we do, I do have one shout out, and I've already told Valerie this. When we're thinking about colonialism and the role of colonialism in this work, in the catalog, Valerie does a wonderful, wonderful analogy, or she makes it resonate with Caliban in The Tempest. And it's just a beautiful passage on thinking through how colonialism could be thought about in this work that I highly, highly recommend. Now with that, can we talk? I could not leave us without saying that. So I got that in. Maybe we can talk about something else because time is growing so short. And Felice said she's going to be very, very strict about only one thing, and that is that you actually get time for lunch.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for attending this, thinking through this with us today. I really appreciate it.